Good afternoon, I'm Captain Stevens. I'm an instructor here at 5th Ranger Training Battalion. The class that you're about to receive is a basic class on the operations order, which is going to help you to be successful here in the mountains and in Florida. This class is very similar to the one that you're going to receive when you come through this course. Understand that this is a very basic op order class and we're not going to go into excruciating detail. However, if you go by what you're about to receive, you're going to be very successful here in the mountains and then in Florida. First thing that we're going to discuss is the 5 principles of patrolling. We know that the 5 principles of patrolling are planning, reconnaissance, security, control, and common sense. So what we like to do here in Ranger School is we like to think that all of these principles of patrolling are equally important. They're mutually supporting. If you don't have one, you're probably missing another one. So keep that in mind throughout the planning process. Now we'll go ahead and go on to the actual troop leading procedures. So what are the troop leading procedures? Troop leading procedures is basically a process to help you create a plan to accomplish a mission. There's 8 steps to this. First one being receive the mission, followed by issue a warning order, make a tentative plan, initiate movement, conduct reconnaissance, complete the plan, issue the operations order, and then supervise and refine. So one thing to keep in mind with the troop leading procedures is these do not necessarily have to be conducted in any particular order. For example, you can initiate movement at any time to help support your mission. You can initiate movement before you have a mission. All you have to do is prepare for a potential follow-on mission. As a leader, we're always supervising and refining our plans and making sure that our subordinates are doing the right thing. So that's all part of the troop leading procedures. Just keep in mind that we can do this, we can do each one of these steps throughout the process. Next thing we're going to do is move on to step 1, which is receive the mission. There's 3 ways, according to doctrine, that we receive a mission. It's either going to be by a warning order, a fragmentary order, or an operations order. So we know that based on our classes from Darby that a warning order is an order in preparation for the actual operations order that you're going to get. The operations order is the base order that you're going to execute your missions off of, and then a frago is anything from the operations order that has changed. So as we receive our mission, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to conduct a hasty analysis. And I say hasty specifically because step 2 is issue the warning order. We have 30 minutes to issue that warning order. So we need to conduct a hasty analysis due to the time crunch. Later on in step 3, we will conduct a detailed analysis. But going with the hasty analysis, we're going to still use METTC to do this. So the first thing that we're going to look at is our mission. What we want to understand with our mission is we want to understand our platoon mission and we want to understand 1 level up, our company mission. The 2 levels up comes later. We'll discuss that during our detailed analysis. The important pieces to target here for the hasty mission analysis is you want to understand who's operating, what they're doing, and where they're doing it. Next thing we're going to cover is enemy analysis. The 3 pieces that we want to understand for enemy analysis are who, what, and where. For the who, we want to understand who we're fighting and what their organization is doing as a whole on a broad spectrum. For the what, we want to understand what the enemy is doing currently, and then for the where, we want to figure out where the enemy is and we want to plot them on the map. We're going to do this so that we can understand, we can get a better picture of how we're going to comprise our plan. Next thing that we're going to discuss is terrain. Now, we think with terrain, the first thing that comes to mind is OACOC. We're not going to conduct OACOC just yet because we're still in the hasty analysis. OACOC is going to come later in the detailed analysis. For terrain, what we want to focus on now is what is significant, what is absolutely significant. So this is going to be something that is going to either significantly delay your time or completely disrupt your movement. An example here would be if you identify along the potential route that you're going to take that there is a cliff or a river obstacle or something that's going to require you to conduct rehearsals prior to movement. So here in the mountains, we have multiple obstacles. However, a mountain doesn't necessarily comprise an obstacle that we want to discuss at this point. Again, what we want to target is something significant that's going to cause us to have to do rehearsals prior to SP. Now that we've conducted hasty analysis, we're ready to move on to step 2, which is issue the WARNO. Your WARNO should be issued within 30 minutes of your receipt of mission. The key here is you don't want to continue to wait for further information. You never want to withhold information. You want to put that information out and ensure that it's received, and then you can issue as many WARNOs as necessary throughout the planning process. Now that we understand what comprises of the WARNO, we're going to go over how to actually brief it. So, just like all the other orders, this is going to be issued in a 5-paragraph format. So, you're going to start off with your task org, and then you're going to move on to your situation, mission, execution, sustainment, and then command and signal. So under your task org, you're going to want to cover who is going to be security, assault 1, assault 2, your supporting element, and then any other attachments and detachments that you have assigned to you. It's not necessarily saying where they're going to be or necessarily assigning task and purpose. It's just going to be a simple task org saying who is going to have what specific role in the mission. Next, we're going to cover, then you're going to move on to the situation. Under situation, first thing you're going to cover is AOI. This is going to be area of influence. Area of influence is simply anything that can affect your actual area of operations. So this is when you're going to orient and box your area of influence. Next, you're going to cover AO, which is your area of operation. Your area of operation is generally going to be smaller than your AOI, and it's basically where you are actually operating, where you are going to have units on the ground conducting your mission. This is where you're going to go ahead and trace and familiarize, and then you're going to identify where friendly elements are, you're going to identify where potential enemies are, and then you're going to go ahead and point out any significant terrain features, you're going to point out any significant roads or obstacles, things of that nature that you identified in your hasty analysis. Then you're going to go over your hasty enemy analysis. Your hasty enemy analysis, again, is just going over who, what, and where. You're identifying where the enemy is that you're going to be fighting, and then who they are, and generally what they're doing. Then you're going to make sure that you identify all of this on the map. You're going to point it out and actually show your subordinates where it is. Once you've completed briefing your situation, you're going to go ahead and brief your mission. Your mission statement is going to cover the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why. You're going to ensure that you include your task and purpose, and you're going to read your mission statement twice. Your mission statement is going to be found in the execution paragraph of hire's order. Once you've briefed your mission statement, you're going to move on to execution. For your execution, you're going to cover the general order of the operation. So you're going to identify where you are, where you're going, your objective, and then your potential patrol base for the night. Now that we have completed step 2 and issued our WARNO, we're ready to move on to step 3, make a tentative plan. Now, again, we have conducted a hasty analysis specific for the WARNO. Now that we've conducted the hasty analysis, we've issued our WARNO, we're ready to move on to actually developing our full plan. So here we're going to conduct detailed planning. Now, we're still going to use METTC for it, we're just going to go into a lot more detail. So, when we look at mission now, not only are we going to look at our platoon mission and our company mission to understand how we're going to operate within the company's AO, we're also going to look at 2 levels up, which is going to be the battalion mission. And the goal there is to understand how your platoon fits into the bigger picture. So, things to be sure you consider here are, where are the friendly units that are operating in the area, because you want to be sure that as you progress through your analysis that you're not committing fratricide by failing to take into account where friendly elements are. So once you've conducted your analysis 2 levels up and understand how your mission fits into the battalion's mission, we're going to move on to enemy. So there's several things that we want to take into account when we look at enemy. We want to look at things like composition, disposition, strength, most probable and most dangerous courses of action, and then this is all going to result in a sit temp. So the first thing that we're going to look at is composition. For our composition, it's simply the line wire diagram that you've seen before, where it gives you a breakdown of what the enemy element looks like. So, for example, if you look at our platoon's composition, our platoon consists of 4 squads with a headquarters element. So in those 4 squads, we have 1 weapon squad and 3 rifle squads, which are broken down each into teams. Our weapon squad is broken down into 2 machine gun teams, each with an M240, and then our other 3 squads are broken down into 2 fire teams, each equipped with a saw, a 320 grenade launcher, M4s, and things of that nature. All you're doing for the enemy is you're breaking that down in the same way. As you do that, you want to consider how that enemy is going to break down their element. For example, if we have a platoon and we need to break that platoon into 2 sections, we're not just going to send a rifle squad and a weapon squad off and then 2 rifle squads off. We're going to consider that we have 2 machine guns and maybe break that squad up and send them each with a section. So that's something to consider as an example, but the idea for a composition is you want to know how many of the enemy and what equipment they have, which is also going to answer the question for strength. So consider that strength is generally going to be given to you in a percentage, but you want to brief it as a number. So for example, if a platoon is at 75% strength, well, what does that tell you? If it's a 40-man platoon at 75% strength, that means they have 30 personnel. So how are those 30 personnel going to be distributed throughout the platoon? Because consider that the enemy is going to account for their losses. Just remember that strength is always briefed as a number. It's not briefed as a percentage. Next, we're going to look at disposition. So once we've identified how many of the enemy is available and what their element consists of as far as men, weapons, and equipment, we can look at our disposition. So the disposition that you're generally going to receive is going to show enemy squads or enemy teams and where they are on the battlefield. Where we generally see people fail is they take those teams and they just draw the tactical graphic for a team and they just leave it there, and that's their level of analysis. That's not really analysis, and that doesn't really tell us at the platoon level what we're going to be facing on the objective. All that tells us is there's a team there. What we're looking for on the disposition is specific to how many personnel, what weapon systems do they have, and where are they located? How are they oriented on the objective? So if, for example, there is an enemy element that is guarding a bridge and they're equipped with a mortar system, a medium machine gun, and 2 rifles, being a 4-man team or a 5-man team, where are they going to be positioned? Me personally, I would assess that the machine gun is probably going to be overwatching the bridge, located, maybe somewhere around in this area, and then you're going to have the mortar where it can support with indirect fire, so it's going to be within range in a clearing so that it's not having to penetrate overhead cover. And then you're going to have the riflemen stationed maybe guarding a road or pulling overwatch somewhere or maybe initiating a rest plan. All right? So the idea is that you're painting a picture for what exactly the enemy is doing at that time and how they're oriented on the objective. Again, it's not just there's a team here on the objective, there's individuals in that team and where are they located. That's what analysis actually is. So once you understand what the enemy's doing, what their composition is, what their strength, what their disposition is, you can begin to understand what their scheme of maneuver is going to be. Now, their scheme of maneuver is basically their most probable course of action. So when we look at most probable course of action, we're trying to figure out what the enemy is going to do on his own. As he operates, he has a mission. What is his mission and how is he going to conduct it? Also, you're going to come up with a most dangerous course of action. So the difference between your most probable and your most dangerous course of action is, for example, if the enemy has more personnel that are allotted from another team, if they have a specific heavy weapon that has not been accounted for elsewhere, and you've got to account for how you're going to mitigate this additional threat. So basically you should have two schemes of maneuver. You should have a most probable course of action, and you should have a most dangerous course of action. Now that we understand how the enemy is going to fight, we can move on to terrain. Under terrain, we're also going to look at weather. So we're going to start off with the terrain, and we're going to look at OAKOC. So OAKOC stands for Obstacles, Avenues of Approach, Key Terrain, Observation, Fields of Fire, Cover and Concealment. So under obstacles, things that we want to look for are what is going to significantly disrupt or delay our formations. Now, as we get into OAKOC, we also want to consider how it's going to affect us, how it's going to affect the enemy, and ultimately a conclusion on how it is going to affect your scheme of maneuver at the end of the day. So, for example, an obstacle might include a cliff, a river that you have to build a rope bridge. Perhaps it might include an LDA crossing. So, for things like that, you may have to conduct rehearsals. For example, if you've got to conduct a stream crossing, you may have to construct a rope bridge or establish a rappel lane for a cliff, things like that. And you need a rope team who is prepared to conduct that task. As far as enemy, things that you want to consider are if maybe you're doing a raid. If you're executing a raid and that enemy's been on that objective for a while, they may have had time to construct bunkers and establish protective obstacles. Things like this you have to take into consideration as you build your plan so that you can understand how to be prepared for it and how to mitigate those additional threats. Once we understand obstacles and how they're going to affect us, how they're going to affect the enemy, and then what we're going to do about it, we move on to avenues of approach. An avenue of approach is simply a way to get to the objective. Now, things to consider here are the enemy's got to get to the objective just like you do. So they're going to use roads, they can potentially use trails, things of that nature. Now, because of the threat that the enemy is probably going to be using high-speed avenues of approach like that, you want to consider how you're going to get there. So yes, a road is still an avenue of approach for friendly as well. However, you may want to consider that more as a technique to get an FLA in to an AXP or something like that. You also want to look at how you're going to get there. A spur up a mountain to the objective is potentially an avenue of approach. It's a dismounted avenue of approach, but nonetheless you can still get there. So the things that you want to look at for an avenue of approach are you want to look at what type. So for example, it's either mounted, dismounted, aerial, things like that. You also want to look at what size formation it's going to support and the size of the mobility corridor. So your mobility corridor may be able to support a squad, platoon, company, battalion, etc. And then finally, you want to be able to understand how fast you're going to be able to move. For example, if it's a mounted mobility corridor at the platoon size, you can probably move along that at 20, 30, 40 kilometers an hour. Versus a dismounted mobility corridor up a spur, you may be looking at moving 1 kilometer an hour. So as we put this together, we're going to understand that we want to have enemy avenues of approach, and we also want to have friendly avenues of approach so that we can understand where the enemy's reinforcements may come from and where we can bring in our support. Moving on from avenues of approach, we come on to key terrain. An example for key terrain could be a hilltop or a bridge or a building. Basically, the bottom line is that a piece of key terrain has to provide a marked advantage to whoever holds it. Now consider that if you mark something as key terrain and you also template that there's going to be an enemy OP there. Keep in mind, you now have to do something about that. You can plan for fires on that, you can seize it, you can control it, but bottom line is that you have to do something about it. You have to mitigate the fact that that enemy owns that piece of key terrain. The other thing to consider with key terrain is you can also ask yourself is it decisive? Now, the difference between key and decisive is key terrain provides an advantage. Decisive terrain must be controlled in order for the mission in order for the mission to reach its decisive point. Now that we have covered key terrain, we can move on to observation and fields of fire. The key things to keep in mind with observation and fields of fire is this is a time where you want to assess what direct and indirect weapon systems are going to be most effectively emplaced and where to emplace them. So, for example, if you have a clearing down a main avenue of approach where you can see for 800 meters, what weapon system are you going to employ there and what kind of range are you going to get out of it? So, based off of that limited information, you can assess that maybe an M240 would be the best thing to place on that avenue of approach so that it can cover it. You can also consider that you have good observation, so maybe you can call for fire and use the company 60mm mortar to affect that. In the event that it's a dismounted avenue of approach where you can only see 200 or 300 meters, maybe the M249 would be the best place to employ that weapon system. Keep in mind that as you look down things like linear danger areas or off into the tree line from a linear danger area, you're going to have different amounts of visibility. So you want to consider what weapon system is just going to be in place best there. And you want to talk about these things when you get onto your op order. You want your gun teams to understand that their best employment is going to be located where they can most effectively use their weapon where it's going to support your mission. In the event that you have dead space, the best weapon system to use there is going to be either Claymores or M320s. So you want to consider how long are you going to be there. If you're going to be there a while, you might want to put a Claymore out. If you're not going to be there very long, you may just want to cover it with an M320. Moving on from observation and fields of fire, the next thing we're going to talk about is cover and concealment. So you want to consider here, what's the difference? The difference is, in simple terms, that cover stops bullets, concealment just keeps you from being seen. So what does that mean on the ground? Cover is basically something hard that's at least 18 inches thick. It could be a tree, it could be dirt, it could be rocks, anything of that nature. Concealment could be something like bushes, or you can cover yourself in leaves. It could be foliage in general, any kind of camouflage netting, things like that. But ultimately, the difference is that cover stops bullets, concealment does not. Now that we've gone through OACOC, we're going to cover weather. So for weather, things that we want to consider, we can use the acronym VWPCT, which is going to cover visibility, winds, precipitation, cloud cover, and then temperature and humidity. Keep in mind, we only want to target what is absolutely important. So if, for example, it's 60 degrees today and tonight it's going to drop down to 10 degrees, that's probably something that we want to understand and be prepared to mitigate. If, for example, it's sunny and it's a nice day out and it's expected to rain 8 inches tonight, again, probably something that we want to know about. If we're going to have high winds, things that's going to affect, things like smoke, it's going to affect your air, so you may not be able to get medevac in. It may cancel your air assault and you have to truck infill. So you want to understand how the weather is going to affect your mission, and that's where you cover this under the terrain portion. Now that we've understand the terrain and the weather that we're going to be fighting in, we're going to take into account our troops. This is basically what's available to us. We've already come to an understanding of what elements we have that are supporting us, so we know what attachments we have, we know what attachments we know what our attachments and detachments are. We know basically who's our assault 1, who's our assault 2, security, weapons squad, things of that nature. Now, before we get too far into this, the next thing that we're going to go over is nesting. All right, so we have a couple different types of nesting here that we want to look at. So we've got vertical nesting and we've got horizontal nesting. So vertical nesting is important because it ensures that our element is in line with HIRE's mission. So what we want to look at here is our task and purpose in line with the company's task and purpose, in line with the battalion's task and purpose, and so on. So as you select your DO and your shaping operations, you've got to understand that all of these have to tie together. So for example, if we are operating as the company's decisive operation, we should have the same task and purpose as the company. If our sister platoon is shaping Operation 1, they cannot have the same purpose. They can have the same task, but it cannot be the same purpose. It works the same way at the platoon level. So as a platoon leader, you've got to pick which squad is going to be your decisive operation. So for example, our decisive operation is going to be Assault 1. Assault 1 is who everyone else is going to be supporting in the platoon, making security, Assault 2, and weapons shaping Operation 1, shaping Operation 2, shaping Operation 3, respectively. So what we've got to keep in mind here is that no one can have the same purpose as the decisive operation. They can have the same task, but not the same purpose. So for example, if our task is to destroy, Assault 2 can also have a task of destroy. But if our purpose is to deny enemy freedom of maneuver along this trail, Assault 2s cannot be the same. Now, as we move into shaping Operation 2 and 3, some examples of things that we can do there are, for example, if we have security squad, we can task them to isolate. And we can task them to isolate. The purpose can be to prevent the enemy from affecting the platoon decisive operation. Then we have our support by fire, who also needs a task and purpose, so we can give them a task and purpose of, we can give it fix, we can give them support by fire, we can give them suppress. What I think is most appropriate for the scenarios that we do at Ranger School is support by fire, because support by fire is a friendly based task, meaning they are always covering their maneuver element. If we give them a task like suppress is enemy focused. So theoretically, as soon as they stop firing, the enemy is able to, again, maneuver and return fire. And then their purpose can be in order to allow freedom of maneuver for the decisive operation. So as we look at troops, equipment, things like that, we've got to understand now what support this is going to require. Things like water resupply, things like ammunition resupply. When are we going to rest? How long are we going to rest? Things of that nature. And as we plan through this allows us to understand what our capabilities and limitations are so that we can accomplish the mission. The next thing that we will talk about is time. The things to keep in mind here are 1/3, 2/3 rule and backwards planning. For 1/3, 2/3, simply the leader takes 1/3 of the overall time for planning, and he's going to take that for himself to make a tentative plan. The 2/3 is reserved for subordinates to conduct their planning and then conduct rehearsals as well. So you'll notice by the timeline that it's not necessarily following the 1/3, 2/3 rule. So the thing to keep in mind there is parallel planning. Parallel planning is simply keeping your squad leaders informed and your subordinate leaders informed so that they can plan alongside you so that they know what you're doing. Backwards planning is going to be simply looking at when your hit time is, when your SP time is. You're going to identify those key and critical times, and you're going to backwards plan off of that so that you know how long it's going to take you to conduct movement, you know how long it's going to take you to conduct the leader's recon, you know how long it's going to take you to establish your assault positions. So based off of that, if your hit time is 2100, you know it's going to take you an hour to get into your assault positions and 2 hours to conduct your leader's recon. You know that you need to be in your ORP established no later than 1800. And then from there, you can backwards plan off of your movement and figure out when you need to leave your patrol base. Now, next thing under the time heading that we're going to cover is key and critical times. The difference is that critical times are dictated by hire in the order. A key time is simply something that the leader creates so that he can establish how to meet his critical times that are passed down to him from hire. So the difference is that critical times are passed down by hire and must be met for mission accomplishment. Key times are developed by the leader at the planning level. Now we're going to move on to troops. What you want to consider here is the troops that you have immediately available, to include attachments, detachments. So for example, you have an FO attached to you, and generally we don't do detachments here at Ranger School, but another attachment that you'll have 3 scouts, which are Ranger instructors. What you also want to consider is what equipment that you have in your platoon. For example, claymores, M240s, saws. How many squads do you have? Things like that, and where you want to place your daggers. So as you conduct that analysis, you can move on to civilians. Civilians are generally considered here at Ranger School to be enemy sympathizers, which means that we want to avoid all contact with them. We generally want to avoid any established campsites or buildings, vehicles, things like that. We want to make sure that we avoid any linear danger areas such as the roads that run through the mountains, and in the event that we cross them, we want to ensure that we're not seen by civilians. So the goal here is to minimize civilian contact. Other than that, you only want to brief significant civilian infrastructures that may be in the area so that your platoon is aware of where they may be. Now that we have completed step 3, make a tentative plan, there's a couple of outputs that we should have from this. The first one is a GDOT, or a graphical depiction of terrain. This is basically a terrain model. So you can make this you can draw it on paper, you can create it in the dirt with rocks and sticks. It's all based on your creativity and what you have available to you. Next thing is a COA statement. Your COA statement is basically going to describe your operation and how you're going to conduct it. So the first piece of your COA statement is going to cover a form of maneuver. So there's 6 forms of maneuver. We generally here in Ranger School use an infiltration. So for example, that's going to sound like this. We will accomplish this by conducting an infiltration. Next, we're going to cover decisive point. So your decisive point is the point in your operation where your odds of success have drastically increased. So an example of this is as you're pushing a ball up a hill toward the other side, at what point do you really not have to push anymore before it falls over? That's kind of an example of how to think of this. So, for example, if our mission is to conduct an ambush and our task is to destroy, our purpose is to deny enemy freedom of maneuver, and assuming that the enemy has 1 vehicle with a medium machine gun and 4 dismounts. So from that, we could make the decisive point disabling the vehicle, because now the enemy cannot escape. They're in your kill zone and they're disabled. So the only thing that they can do is basically shoot back. They're unable to maneuver. Another example could be destruction of the vehicle and the machine gun that's on the truck. The whole purpose of a decisive point is so that your subordinates can understand at what point the mission has drastically increased its chances of success. So once you determine what a decisive point is for the mission, then you have to explain why it's decisive. So for example, disabling the enemy vehicle is decisive to this operation because it's going to prevent the enemy from being able to escape from our kill zone. The next thing that you're going to cover is the task and purpose of your decisive operation and then your additional shaping operations. And finally, you're going to cover the purposes of any exterior assets you have, such as fires, engineers, things of that nature. And then the last thing that we're going to cover is end state. So your end state is relevant to friendly, enemy, civilians, and terrain. So for example, your end state for friendly could be prepared for follow-on mission. For enemy, could be all enemy destroyed on the objective. Civilians could be no civilian casualties and no civilian interference. And then finally, for terrain, your end state could be that the area is returned to its natural state. Next, we have concept of the operation. So concept of the operation basically breaks your mission up into phases. You can pick your number of phases. It's all about how it makes sense to you. The preferred method is to use approximately 4 phases, because more than that, it gets too many and you're creating confusion. Too few and you're putting too much in one area. So for concept of the operation, Things that you want to cover are when the phase begins, when the phase ends, and then key tasks that are going to occur during that phase. For example, this is going to be a 4-phase operation. Phase 1 will be planning, phase 2 will be movement, phase 3 will be actions on the objective, and phase 4 will be movement to and establishment of the patrol base. Phase 1 begins at the beginning of warning order and concludes with movement toward the objective. Key tasks here are issuing the op order and rehearsals. Phase 2 is going to begin with movement toward the objective and will conclude with establishment of the ORP. Critical to this phase is undetected movement throughout the AO. Phase 3 will begin with the Leaders Recon SP from the ORP and will complete once the entire platoon has completed actions on the objective and returned to the ORP. Critical to this phase is destruction of the enemy on the objective and not being compromised during the Leaders Recon. Finally, phase 4 will begin with movement from the ORP to the patrol base and be complete when the platoon is prepared for follow-on missions. Critical to this phase, again, is undetected movement throughout the AO and establishing a patrol base and being prepared for a follow-on mission from higher. The next output is a scheme of movement. So your scheme of movement is going to consist of things like checkpoints, distance direction between, actions on contact, contingencies, CCPs, HLZs, things of that nature. Your scheme of maneuver is going to be exactly how you're going to conduct your plan from start to finish. Things that it's going to include here is establishment of the ORP, recon of the objective, establishment of the assault positions, actions on the objective, withdrawal from the objective, movement back to the ORP, movement from the ORP to the patrol base, and then your patrol base plan. Task to subordinate units, this is when you want to give your guidance to your subordinates as far as exactly what you want them to do. This is when you're going to cover things like your terrain model for task condition standards. You're going to cover what you expect your platoon sergeant to go into detail about his medical plan and his CASEVAC, and when you need your security plan established and completed for the patrol base. You can also give guidance to your FO for what you want for a fires plan. You can give guidance to your Assault 1 squad leader on a task condition standard for an example of a blow up of the objective. So those are some examples to cover for task to subordinate units. Next, we move on to timeline. Your timeline, and an example is given, but basically this timeline is going to be specific to receipt of the mission to your SP. This is not specific to your mission. Things to include on there would be your objective time and your patrol base time, but again, this timeline is focused on things like when do you want to inspect your fires, when do you want to inspect your routes, when do you want to inspect your terrain model, when do you need your security plan completed, when do you need your when do you want to be back briefed on what the medical plan is. So from there, we're going to move on to sustainment. Sustainment is going to cover maintenance. Sustainment is going to cover things like movement and how you're getting there. If you have any manifests, this is when your platoon sergeant is going to brief what he wants for manifests, as far as load plans, bump plans, things like that. He's also going to come out with a maintenance plan for things like weapons, NVGs, commo equipment, things of that nature. Finally, we're going to move on to command and signal. For command and signal, we're only going to brief what is greatly significant before the op order, because you're going to cover most of this during the op order. Now that we have completed step 3 and we have all of our outputs, we can continue on for the remaining 5 troop leading procedures. So, as we discussed earlier, all of these steps can be conducted in any necessary order, and generally they are ongoing. So next we have initiate movement. There's a lot of movement that needs to be initiated. We've got to ensure that everything is being enforced and that leaders are staying on top of their troopers to make sure that they're doing the right thing, conducting what they're supposed to be conducting. Then we're going to move on to step 5, conduct reconnaissance. We're conducting reconnaissance throughout. We're going to ensure that we look at our maps so that we know where we are, where we're going, where we're trying to get to. Also, we're going to conduct a leader's recon of the objective, which is going to facilitate completion of the plan. So as we conduct reconnaissance on our leader's recon, we are completing the plan. We're going to confirm or deny whether or not our plan is actually going to work. And then we're going to make adjustments to the plan to ensure that the plan will be successful. So the plan is basically completed once the leader's recon is complete. Now that we've completed the plan, we're going to issue the order and ensure that it is understood by all, and then finally we're going to move on to supervise and refine. Supervise and refine, again, is conducted throughout the entire patrol. Leaders always need to be involved with their soldiers and their subordinates and ensure that they are doing the right thing, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they understand what's happening around them. So this completes the troop leading procedures. And now we have a good understanding of how to conduct mission analysis and what needs to be done in order to prepare for the operations order.